Hi, Max. Do you hear me? Hello, Max?
How's everybody doing?
Hey, how are you doing?
Great.
I'm fine. So I added you as a co-organizer, co-host, so you can like unmute people, etc. if needed.
Perfect. Perfect. How's your evening going?
Well, for me it's going fine. Working as usual. Actually, it did not change a lot, this lockdown stuff.
Yeah, right.
And for you?
Going well. Just played a bunch of Fortnite, relaxed a little bit, and now I'm ready for giving a talk.
That's cool. Okay, let's just wait a bit for more people to join, and then we can start. In the meantime, we can maybe have some pre-talk questions. Like, yeah, so I know you very well because I was going a lot to React conferences like React Amsterdam, React Europe, etc. And so styled components and stuff. But if you can present yourself to the people and the meetup, that would be nice.
Sure. Hi, I'm Max. I live in Austria, which is not very far away. Fun fact, actually, my very first tech conference that I spoke at ever was in Bruges, JSConf Belgium, back in, must have been 2016, I think. That was the first conference I ever spoke at, which was really great, actually. And afterwards, I looked at Brussels and Antwerp. Really like Belgium. Yeah, I work at Gatsby. Used to work at GitHub before that. Founded Spectrum, and I'm most widely known in the React community for making styled components and React boilerplate. That's sort of it.
Okay.
If you have any questions for me, just throw them in the chat. I have the chat open, or unmute yourself and ask me. That's what I'm here for.
Yeah. So how did you get into programming actually? Because I think you got into programming quite young. I remember that when you created styled component, you were 19 or 20 or something like this.
Right? Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
So when did you start getting involved in the React community? And how did that happen?
I got into React initially because I got an internship as a front-end developer, just general front-end developer, at an agency in London called Animate. And so I moved to London for 3 months, and they taught me HTML, CSS, and then like jQuery for 2 months. And then after 2 months of just like learning stuff, they were like, well, we've kind of taught you everything there is that we wanted to teach you about HTML and CSS and like jQuery. So what do you want to learn next? And I was like, well, I don't know. What should I learn? And so the guy looked around for a bit, and then he went, well, there's this cool new framework called React that I've heard of, but that we haven't really tried. Why don't you build something with that and let us know how it goes? And that's really how I got into React and built a bunch of projects with it. And then eventually made React boilerplate. And the rest is sort of history. How did you all get into React? What was your first React apps? What were your first React apps?
Well, actually, when I started working as a programmer, I started with PHP back then, and doing some jQuery for the front end part, etc. And then I got involved into a project. So the project was basically a Backbone JS project. That's where when I got really into front end and JavaScript technology, and I started doing JavaScript as a full-time job. And then the project after was basically to kind of convert all of this code base. It was actually a content management system and basically convert all of those code base because Backbone was dead, and then we converted it to React, and
Nice.
that's how I got into React actually.
Nice.
I don't know if other people have questions.
Nobody said anything in chat so far. I'm not sure if everybody's just not here yet.
Yeah, well, we have 28 people in the room, so I guess we can start. Let me just. I'm a bit new to the Zoom stuff, so sometimes it takes time to find people. Okay. Let me. Okay, so now we are around 30 people. So ready to start, Max?
Sure. Do you want me to share my screen?
Yeah, you can share your screen. I think if you share it, mine will disappear.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Perfect.
Maybe just open the chat. If anybody has questions, just throw them into the chat. Hold on, where's the chat? What did I just do with it? Oh, here we go. Here we go. This and that. So I've got the chat open. If you have any questions, just throw them in there. Should be able to see them. And then I guess I'll just do it. Do you just want me to get started?
Yes. For me, you can get started. I just accepted one more person from the waiting room. So yeah, you can get started. Yeah.
Sure. All right. So today I'm going to talk about the past, present, and future of CSS-in-JS. My name is Max. I just did a whole intro. I work at Gatsby. Basically, used to work at GitHub, made style components and React boilerplate. That's sort of the really quick version. Before I dive into the past, present, and future of CSS-in-JS, let's talk for just a second about how CSS-in-JS works and what it actually is. So CSS-in-JS allows you to write your styles in JavaScript, literally write CSS in JavaScript. So here, what we can see is a style components code snippet, where we define a title component, which is equal to a style.h1. Now, this style.h1 function creates a component that renders an h1, right? So once you render that component, like we do below, it'll actually render an h1. And then we pass in some styles. We say color pale violet red and font size of 24 pixels. So our title component will now render an h1 with a color of pale violet red and a font size of 24 pixels. Kind of obvious. Now, what you see there with the weird backtick syntax, that's tagged template literals. That is just a different way of calling a function that has some different properties. It's not all that important. In theory, you could also just call it as a normal function. Just imagine parentheses if that confuses you. They're really cool. They're just like a different way to call a function. And really importantly, CSS-in-JS takes your CSS, but then transforms it just a little bit. Specifically, creates a unique class name. So if you just look at the screen for a second, because this animation is really quick, it basically turns this code into this in the DOM. So it injects some CSS into the DOM, a random class name that is based on a hash of the contents of the class. So it's completely unique. And then attaches that class name to the h1 that is rendered to the actual HTML. That's sort of how CSS-in-JS works. Now, why would you even want to do that? Why would you even want to use CSS-in-JS, right? Personally, there's 5 reasons why I like using. The first one is confidence, right? It gives me a ton of confidence because I can add, change, and delete CSS without any unexpected consequences, right? That leads to really painless maintenance because I never have to go on a hunt for the CSS affecting a specific piece of code or a specific HTML element ever again, right? In fact, if I delete the component, I automatically delete all the CSS affecting that component as well. So I never end up with dead CSS. Never, ever. There's no way to end up with CSS that is unused, which is massive. If you ever used a maybe not as well architected front end that has one large CSS file, eventually that always turns into an append-only style sheet in my experience. Like eventually people just keep adding to it, but never removing anything, because you can never be quite sure if something isn't used somewhere or toggled through some JavaScript or maybe in some HTML interpolated. Like you never really know. But with CSS-in-JS, you literally have all the CSS that affects the component right there and then. And so if you delete the component, you automatically delete all of its CSS. That's huge for teamwork, right? Because honestly, not everybody is an expert in CSS, right? Not everybody has tens of decades of experience with CSS. You'll have some members on your team. Maybe they come in from the backend side of things. Maybe they're more junior, right? That don't know CSS that well. And so with CSS-in-JS, you can avoid these sort of common mistakes pretty easily, right? You can't have class name overlaps because every single class name is unique. You can't have dead CSS because as soon as you delete the component, you also delete its styling. And so it's sort of automatically sidestep some of these common CSS frustrations that you can have, which keeps the code base really clean, even if some juniors are working on it. Now, I'm not saying that with CSS-in-JS, you can only write good code. Of course, you can still write horrible code. If you write horrible code, it's going to be horrible code, no matter if it's written in a CSS file, in CSS-in-JS, in whatever you want, right? It's just going to be horrible code. But there's a lot of common things that don't have to be sort of consciously thought about. We can just automatically remove them by inventing these new APIs like style components. Now, the next point is one that many people sort of initially don't really get. CSS-in-JS actually has very fast performance. And the reason for that is because with style components, for example, we know exactly which components are used on a page. So when you're server-side rendering a React app with style components, what will happen is that we know which components and which states specifically you're using on a page, and we're only going to inject the CSS that is actually necessary to render that page. There's no extra work to be done by you. There's no like tooling that you have to set up. That's just how it works out of the box. That is fully automatic, which means you're going to get critical CSS out of the box every single page for every single user, which is amazing, right? Making that happen without CSS-in-JS is possible, but involves a lot of tooling and is very, very finicky. If you've ever tried making that happen, it's a real pain in the ass, right? And with CSS-in-JS, that's just built in, which is really, really, really nice. So there's sort of a trade-off there, right? The JavaScript bundles are slightly heavier, but my users download the minimum possible CSS payload, and they avoid the extra network request to fetch the CSS file. So in practice, usually, this ends up meaning that you have a marginally slower time to interactive than with vanilla CSS, but a much, much faster first meaningful paint. The content is rendered to the browser much quicker because there's much less CSS to render, which means the request actually completes much quicker and it avoids the extra network request. But then, of course, the JavaScript files take a little bit longer to load in, so you end up with a slightly slower time to interactive, if that makes any sense. And then the fifth reason that I really like it is dynamic styling. I can have a global theme. I can have any kind of stuff in my theme. I can have various variants of my components, and I can really easily adjust the styling. I no longer have to mess around with, if you ever built a JavaScript app, you've likely conditionally triggered class names, right? There's a famous package on NPM literally called class names, which is downloaded I don't know how many tens of millions of times every week, because it's actually kind of tedious to concatenate class names based on sort of states. And with CSS-in-JS, I don't actually have to worry about that. I just select which props have which styling, and that's it. It's much easier and much more simple. And also having the ability to have a global theme that can adjust anything is super, super powerful. The overarching theme of all of this is sort of CSS-in-JS guides you to what I like to call the pit of success, right? It guides you towards doing things the right way. Now, like I said, you can still fuck things up, right? If you write bad code, it's going to be bad code, and there's nothing we can do to keep you from doing that, right? But the chances of it being good code, even if you don't quite know what you're doing, even if you have junior team members on the team, even if you have backend people working in your front end, is much, much higher, because it sort of enforces all of these nice benefits into this one package that sort of enforce, unique class names, it enforces no append-only style sheet, it enforces fast performance, it enforces all of these things for you in a way that guides people towards success. Again, it guides. If you write bad code, it's going to be bad code. Now, let's talk a little bit about the present before we dive into the past. CSS-in-JS has taken over the React world. Now, I have a stat here that says 60% of React installs also install a CSS-in-JS library, but that is actually incorrect. It is 90%. Half a year ago, it was 60%. And I checked yesterday again, but then I forgot to update the slides for some reason because I was so excited about this. Literally 90% to 90% of React, 95% of React DOM installs and 90% of React installs also install a CSS-in-JS library. CSS-in-JS has taken over by far. It's by far the most popular way to style React apps right now. So how did we get here? How did we actually end up in this state where so many people are using it and it's sort of being experimented with so much in the past? Let's dive a little bit into it. It first started out really in November of 2014. Two important things happened in November of 2014. At first, Oleg from Berlin published JSS. JSS was the first ever CSS-in-JS library that was publicly released. Now, JSS was actually way ahead of its time. At the time, nobody really cared about it. It didn't gain that much attention, but JSS was actually way, way, way ahead of its time. And we're going to get into what that means later. The other thing that happened was that Christopher Chedeur from the React team at Facebook gave a talk at a tiny conference in Washington, D.C. called Nation.js. And he gave a talk about how Facebook uses CSS-in-JS. That talk exploded. The slide deck for that talk has actually been seen more than 1 million times by now, I think. If you've read about CSS-in-JS at all, you've probably seen a screenshot of one of his slides, black background, white text, sort of spread all over the page, all the benefits of CSS-in-JS. That talk literally was like a bomb in the entire community. Everybody started talking about it. Everybody was like, what the hell are these guys doing? Is this cool? Is this not cool? How can we do this? And as part of that, it really kicked off a flurry of activity in the community to replicate all the benefits that they had gotten out of it with their own libraries. The first of which was Radium. In January, Formidable Labs published Radium, which was the second CSS-in-JS library ever. And what they tried to do was they sort of tried to attach inline styles, right? Rather than injecting a class name into the DOM, it attached a style attribute to your HTML elements. Now, in hindsight, we actually know that that is not a good approach. It's much slower than just injecting the CSS into the DOM. And with inline styles, you can't do things like media queries, hover selectors, pseudo selectors in general, pseudo elements. All of those things don't work. Radium kind of tried to hack around that with JavaScript, but really, it was a nice try, and I'm glad that somebody went down this route. But nowadays, it's pretty much deprecated. Nobody should be using this package anymore. It was not the right approach. There's better approaches, as we know now. Then in February, one of my coworkers, Brent Jackson, who at the time wasn't a coworker, published Rebase, which you might have used if you've been in the React community at all. Rebase really introduced this sort of CSS components API. You could have a component that is called box, and then you could pass in any kind of property that you want. So you could have a box, and then you would pass a prop called color, and then you would pass blue, background color, red, right? Padding, 4, whatever, right? You could pass any kind of CSS as a prop. Now, Rebase is super great. People still use it a lot. I use it a lot. It's still a great library, and really kicked off this CSS components. In May, we then got CSS Modules. Now, CSS Modules has a star next to its name because it's not technically CSS-in-JS, right? CSS-in-JS is anywhere where you write CSS in JavaScript. With CSS Modules, you're still writing CSS in CSS files, but it really popularized this concept of outputting unique class names, right? Hashing the contents of a class and then attaching a unique class name to the DOM so you avoid any kind of class name overlap. That was a really important step along the way because it really proved to the rest of sort of the community that was a viable approach, right? You could go that route, and it actually turns out that's really nice. Now, CSS Modules, again, still a great library, still used by tons and tons of people. Highly recommend using it. September of 2015, CS.js was released. This is a tiny library that nobody really ever heard of. But it was really the first one that let you write actual CSS in JavaScript. Before then, all the other libraries made you write your CSS as objects. So you would write JSON in your JavaScript, and it would sort of be like color, colon, and then a string of blue, right? And with CS.js, you could write actual CSS syntax in a string in JavaScript. Now, CS.js never really went anywhere. Nobody really ever used it. It was never more than a prototype, but it really proved that this was even possible. In October of 2015, we then got Aphrodite. Khan Academy, the famous education startup, published their own internal CSS-in-JS library that they were using. And Aphrodite really popularized this concept of extracting the critical CSS, which is what I was talking about earlier with the performance thing. They were really the first ones to realize that they could keep track of which CSS is actually used and then only inject that into the DOM. And so they were much more performant than all the other libraries at the time, and everybody immediately jumped on it. Again, Aphrodite, they still use it a ton. Lots of other companies also use it. Great, great, great library. In June of 2016, Robin Frischmann from Berlin then published his own CSS-in-JS library called Fela. And Fela really popularized the concept of making your style a function of state. If you've ever read the React docs, if you've ever seen a React introductory talk, you've likely heard the sentiment that your view is a function of the state with React. right? And with Fela, suddenly your styles were a function of the state. They really popularized this concept of having highly dynamic styling. In July of 2016, we then got Clamor. Sunil Pai, who is now on the React team but used to work at Mintra and the e-commerce startups, built his own CSS-in-JS library called Clamor. And Clamor, he was the first one to discover this sort of insert rule API. And now that's actually not quite true. That's sort of how the story is told most of the time. But in fact, way back in November of 2013, Oleg, the creator of GSS, was already using the insert rule API in GSS. It had sort of been forgotten until 2016 when Sunil Pai discovered it again and then popularized it by telling everybody else about it. An insert rule is basically a much faster way to insert CSS into the browser by skipping the DOM. It's a nice little API. You probably won't ever have to use it unless you're writing a CSS-in-JS library, but it's really, really, really fast. It's much faster than what we were doing previously, which is inserting a style tag and then injecting sort of the CSS by setting the inner text of the style tag. So that's really what Clamor did. It really popularized the insert rule. Now, Clamor was a great library at the time. By now, it's no longer maintained and has sort of been superseded by some other libraries, which we'll get to pretty soon. But great library at the time. October 2016, petehunt and the team at Smite then released JSX style. petehunt is one of the original React folks who used to work at Instagram and built the first Instagram.com with React. And they built JSX style for their own use, which is sort of similar to Rebase, but even more intense than that. You could literally write a div component and put literally any kind of CSS as a prop, and it would just serialize the whole thing. Rebase was a little bit more restrictive, but JSX style really opened that up and made it much, much more permissive and popularized this API widely. Again, JSX style still used by a ton of people, still a great library, highly recommend it. Same month, I was on stage at React NL in Amsterdam, and I announced style components, the first version of style components. Glenn Matter and one of the co-creators of CSS Modules and we sat down in Sydney, and we came up with this new CSS-in-JS library that really invented this new style.element API, right? Where you could write style.div and then pass in a tag template literal and then pass in the styles, and it returned a component. Style components, I mean, obviously still a great library because I made it. I'm just kidding. Style components is still very widely used. We've made it way better, just like all the other libraries. I would recommend using it if you like that API. In December of 2016, Ryan Tsao, the guy who made CS.js 2 years prior, the first one that had the strings of CSS and JavaScript, then made Styletron. He now works at Uber, and Uber heavily uses Styletron for all of their front ends. Styletron really popularized outputting atomic classes. Essentially, Ryan realized that he had full control over the classes. And so rather than just making a unique class name per component, he actually made a unique class name per CSS rule. So you would have a class name for color red, and you would have a class name for background blue. And he realized that most front ends don't have that many unique CSS rules, right? And so you can actually keep your total CSS size pretty low by outputting atomic classes. And in many apps, it actually leads to a much, much even smaller CSS bundle size. If you've seen Tailwind recently, or even before that, Tachyons or base CSS, it's sort of the same concept, except you write CSS normally. You don't have to learn any other API. Just write CSS how you're used to, and then you end up with atomic class names that are fully optimized for you out of the box. Great library, again, widely used, still used by Uber and a bunch of other companies. Super great. In December of 2016 as well, Giuseppe, another Vienna local, released Style JSX, which became the default way to do CSS-in-JS in Next.js, which is a famous React framework. Style JSX really popularized lowering the barrier to entry. With Style JSX, you could just write a style tag in your React code, put some CSS in there, and they would automatically hash the class names for you. And it was really familiar to people who came from HTML and CSS. And that really popularized this concept of, CSS-in-JS doesn't have to mean you write objects. It doesn't have to mean that you write literally in JavaScript. You can write a style tag, put the CSS in there like how you're used to. You can still adjust it with interpolations and however you want to. But it's really familiar. And it's really just like how you would write CSS in an HTML file in a style tag, right? Which is really nice. Again, great library, still widely used. Highly recommended. In March of 2017, we then got astroturf. This was really interesting because astroturf was the first library to have first-class support for static CSS extraction. So what that meant was that you could write your CSS in JavaScript, but then they would extract it into a CSS file at build time. And so rather than having the CSS in JavaScript, you just end up with a normal CSS file like you're used to that is inserted into the HTML with a link tag and then sent to the browser. So for your users, it's essentially as if you had written CSS in a CSS file, but you can take advantage of all the power that you have with JavaScript, right? You can have interpolations, you can have all the automatic class names, you can have all of the nice developer experience of using CSS-in-JS, but then still extract it to a CSS file. Well, performance-wise, there's a trade-off there. It's actually pretty great if you have, for example, a design system and you want to reuse that CSS file in other contexts. If you're maybe building a normal landing page with HTML and CSS and not React, or if you maybe have some other teams that are using Vue or other frameworks, right? Suddenly you can just pass that CSS file around and have other people use it too really, really, really easily, which is really great. Again, astroturf still developed, still great, super awesome. At the time, by the way, the first version of astroturf was called CSS Literal Loader, in case you've heard that name before. Same thing, they just renamed it about a year or two ago. Then in April of 2017, Kenzie Dodds of PayPal released Glamorous. Glamorous sort of popularized, which is strange to say, but it really popularized writing CSS objects. Before that, initially, CSS-in-JS was sort of like a niche thing, right? Nobody was really using it. And then style components came on the scene and we allowed people to write CSS as they were used to for the first time. And people really hook onto that. That's not an English word. People really sort of stuck with that and they really liked it. And then Glamorous came around and Kent was like, yeah, it's nice, but actually writing CSS as objects also has some big benefits. You can compose it much more easily. It's much more familiar for people who are more familiar with CSS with JavaScript, and it has some nice benefits to it. And so he wanted to use the style components API, but still write CSS as objects. And so he made Glamorous. Now Glamorous has by now been deprecated. He's no longer working on it, mainly because basically all other libraries also added support for writing CSS as objects, including style components and all the others. So he was like, yeah, I don't really need to maintain this anymore since the original also has it now. Doesn't really make any sense. And so it's deprecated. But it was a great step along the way because it really pushed everybody else to sort of support everything, however you want to write your CSS. Then in May of 2017, I put style components v2 here, but that's actually not the important point. The important point was that with style components v2, we shipped a new CSS parser. And that CSS parser is called stylus. Now, almost nobody has heard of stylus, which is why I put it into the slides, because there's this guy in Africa called Thai Sultan. And he wrote a fully featured, extremely stable, and extremely fast CSS parser in JavaScript in less than 3 kilobytes. That is mind-boggling. He literally covers all of CSS. It's the best thing I've ever seen. And so with stylus, you sort of get much more performance out of your CSS-in-JS library, right? It's sort of an implementation detail. You probably will never use stylus directly, but for us as CSS-in-JS libraries, we can now suddenly be much more performant because we have this tiny CSS parser that is really, really, really small. Before that, everybody sort of hacked around the whole parsing thing and it didn't really work very well, or you had a large bundle size. And stylus really allowed us to do the best of everything, which was super awesome. In July of 2017, we then got Emotion. Emotion came onto the scene and really was like, hey, we're 10 times more performant than every other CSS-in-JS library. What the hell are you guys doing? And that really pushed everybody else to get much quicker because suddenly Emotion was just so much faster that we had to catch up. And they really started this still ongoing performance competition where nowadays all of the CSS-in-JS libraries are now 10 times faster. We're all pretty much the same speed. It doesn't really matter anymore performance-wise which one you choose. And the only reason that happened is because Emotion pushed everybody to focus on performance, and everybody really did over the past 2 years. Then in September of 2017, we got Linaria. The folks at CallStack in Poland released Linaria, which is similar to astroturf, but lets you use the style components API, but then extract the CSS to a CSS file, just like astroturf, which was huge. And that really popularized this concept of extracting your CSS to a separate CSS file even more. Again, all of these are great libraries. Highly recommend using them. In November of 2018, a year later, we got Emotion version 10. And Emotion version 10 was important because it popularized the CSS prop. They allow you to put a CSS prop onto any DOM element and then put just whatever CSS you want in there, sort of like inline styles, except it gets extracted to a class name and gets injected as actual CSS into the DOM, which means it's much more performant and it supports all of CSS, not just the subset that the style attribute does, which is awesome. And then again, another year later, in June of 2019, we got a theme UI, which really popularized a consistent theming approach with a standard that everybody's based on, where you can then interoperably use various component libraries and Gatsby themes and whatever. Now, as you hear me talk about all of these libraries, you'll notice something. I love all of them. Some of them are deprecated now, but they were important steps along the way. And most of them are still great. Most of them still have the core ideas in there that are awesome. And all of them, most of them I would highly recommend using to you. You know, you probably can't make a wrong choice. But here's the thing. If you look at the last 2 years, right, we've had 2 releases, 2 big important new launches. And now recently there's actually been a little bit more activities, or maybe 2, or maybe you would say 3 or 4. But if you look at 2016, 2015, or even 2017, we got a library basically every other month, right? And now it's happening once a year, maybe twice a year. And that's really what I want to get across here. We've reached a plateau. We're at a level where we're sort of stuck at an intermediate high, right? Where do we go from here? What happens from here? What is the next step? What is the future of CSS-in-JS? And the answer is, I have no idea. I genuinely do not know. But what I do know is that we're not at the finish line, not even close. Imagine, think about the future, right? Think 50 years ahead. In 50 years, do I think we're still going to be writing styled components? Hell no. Do I think we're still going to be writing CSS modules? Hell no. Hopefully not. We would have stagnated for 50 years. 50 years, that's such a long time, right? Or even 10 years, 5 years down the line, right? I don't want to be writing styled components in 5 years or in 10 years. Which is why really what I want to get across today is that we need you to create the future of styling JavaScript apps, not just React apps, but any kind of app, right? We need to keep tinkering. We need to keep inventing things. We need to keep coming up with new ideas and new things. And something else that you might have noticed when I was talking about all of these CSS and JS libraries is that I know all of these people. I know every single one of the people that made anything in the CSS and JS ecosystem. I've talked with them a bunch. And yes, it's a competition for sure, because we all want to be the biggest library after all and whatever. But really, we're all friends and we're sort of stealing from each other almost, right? Whenever somebody brings a new idea to the table, like Emotion did with the CSS prop or performance, or Glamour did with insert rule, or stylecomponents did with stylus, everybody else just sort of steals everybody's best ideas, right? And we all get better as a result of that. But now, all of the existing libraries, we sort of run out of ideas. We're really, nothing much has happened. Like it's changed a little bit, and we've gotten the CSS prop and the SX prop from ThemeUI, but really it's all the same. So really what I'm here today is I want to encourage you to keep experimenting, keep doing things. Now, how do you actually make that happen? I have 3 important tips, and this applies not just to CSS and JS, but to any kind of open source project, right? 3 important tips for making an open source project. The first one is make it work, make it right, and then make it fast. This is really important, because if you spend a bunch of time fine-tuning an API and fine-tuning performance before even ever having launched your library, you'll never know whether anybody even likes it. You'll never know that whether anybody even thinks your idea is valuable, or whether it even feels nice to use, right? What we did with style components is we built a horrible first prototype. The first version of style components, V1, was the worst code I've ever written in my entire life, but it worked. That was the important part. And then I went on stage and I started talking about it. I started talking to people about it. We got people to try it. And then we got feedback, right? Immediately. People were like, how do I do this? How do I do that? How do I media queries? How do I do pseudo elements? How do I do theming? How do I do these things? How do I do that? I have this bug. I have that bug. And because of that feedback, we actually realized what the library still needed. We knew what we needed to do to make it right. We would have never known that just on our own if we just done things with it, right? We needed the feedback from other people. So it was really important that we made it work first and then worked on making it right with all the feedback that we got. And then eventually, once we had all the sort of core APIs in place and had made everything possible, that's when we really started focusing and honing in on performance and making it fast. And then we could sort of spend time refactoring everything, cleaning up the code, making everything nice, making everything super fast. But that was the last step. You know, the most important thing you can do is make it work first, and then immediately share early and share often. That's my second tip. Share as soon as you have any kind of ugly prototype. It doesn't matter how bad your code is. All of my code is bad anyway, but it doesn't matter how bad your code is. Just share it. Share it early, and then whenever you get feedback, whenever you change anything, share it again and again and again and again. Get that feedback loop going. Get that feedback and make your library better, because what makes the library great is all the feedback. Do you think style components or even React or even Angular or Vue or any of these big JavaScript libraries would be where they are without feedback? No, of course not. They've all gotten much, much better because they're used, because there's so much feedback coming in, and then you have smart people sort of triaging and making good decisions based on all of the feedback coming in. So get all that feedback. Share your library early. Share it. It doesn't matter if it's a prototype. It doesn't matter if the code is ugly. It doesn't matter if it has a huge bundle size or slow performance. Just make it work. If you have a good idea, people are going to use it regardless, and they're going to give you feedback. And not only that, they might even help you make it better, right? Which is huge. And then the third tip is to document all the things. I think I spent 5 times as much time on writing documentation for the first version of style components than I ever did on making the first version of style components. We documented everything from start to finish. How do you do anything? How do you do media queries, hover selectors, studio elements, theming? How do you do server-side rendering? How do you do adjusting based on props? How do you do anything, right? I spent so much time writing documentation, way, way more than actually coding, which is why people immediately could use the library, because if nothing's documented, nobody's going to dive into your code and try to figure it out on their own, right? You have to explain and show to them how to actually do things with your library. So to summarize, keep tinkering, keep inventing new things, make it work, make it right, then make it fast. Share early, share often, and document all the things. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you for listening to my monologue. And now, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Max, for for this talk. Guys, in the meetup, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask your questions in the chat.
I saw a question during the talk that I didn't answer because I sort of got into it after, but I want to answer it explicitly. The question was from Hans, who asked, apart from the dynamic styling part, don't we get the same kind of advantages with pure CSS strategies with Babel tools like astroturf? And that is absolutely true, right? You can write your CSS in JavaScript and then extract it out with either astroturf or Linaria, and that works beautifully, right? There's a little bit of a performance trade-off there because they can't do any critical CSS analysis, but for many apps, that's probably not even a problem, right? Only when you get to the really large enterprise apps with hundreds or thousands of routes and many, many, many components, does that really become a huge downside. So yeah, that totally works. That's a good approach. That's why it's in the slides, right? It is CSS-in-JS. You're still writing CSS in JavaScript. And if that fits your use case, if that fits your users, if that fits your application, that's a great choice. Just to answer that explicitly in case that wasn't obvious during the talk. I hope that answers the question. I'm going to take a sip of my wine.
Yeah, I hope everyone. So we have another question.
Yeah, there's another question. Are there still security downsides to CSS-in-JS, or did recent libraries address it? That is such a funny question because there were never any security downsides to CSS-in-JS. There's this one guy that everybody in the CSS-in-JS community knows who he is. I'm not going to say his name because it's not that important, but he wrote this really clickbaity article where he said, oh, CSS-in-JS is horrible for security. And his whole argument was that because you could put anything into the CSS dynamically, you could put something in there that a user sort of put into an input. Essentially, if you let a user write CSS for your applications that is then served to other users, that's a security problem. Well, duh. You can do the same thing if you write CSS normally and then just add it through JavaScript as well, right? But that has nothing to do with CSS-in-JS. That's just an inherent downside of CSS. There is ways to hack people with CSS if you let them just write raw CSS in an input, right? Whenever you do that, you always, always, always have to sanitize it. It doesn't matter if you're using CSS-in-JS. It doesn't matter if you're afterwards injecting that manually. It doesn't matter what you do. You always have to sanitize the CSS-in-JS, the CSS that a user puts into an input. There's no security downside to CSS-in-JS. That has literally nothing to do with CSS-in-JS. I guess, in a way, that's not entirely true because it does make it easier to interpolate CSS that the user wrote, I guess. But it's still, if you don't have validation on your inputs, that's really nothing we can do to fix that. You know what I mean? We can't address your security issue. That's not something we can do. So that question, I get where it's coming from, but there's really no security downside to CSS-in-JS, and there's never been one, right? I hope that answers the question. I'm glad that somebody asked this because I think this is sort of still like a little bit of a ghost that's floating around. We got two questions. First one, can you stylically extract a CSS file at build time with style components? No, but if you use Linaria, you basically get the same API as style components. So you write your style.div, you write your style.h1, you write your tag templates, exact same thing, but then it's extracted to a CSS file. Since they already do that, why would we spend time implementing that, you know? Just use Linaria if you like the style components API, but want a CSS file in the end. And then do you have any tips to organize CSS-in-JS in your project? For example, just add it in the same file or separate them. Highly recommend separating every single component that you make. For example, with style components, I make a new file for every single component that I make, even with style components. Because If I do that, I can then very easily extract that out if I have to reuse it again. We made this mistake at Spectrum. We had sort of every component had an index.js file and then a style.js file. And in the style.js file, we'd put all the style components for that component. But the problem was then you have no idea which components exist, right? We literally rewrote the same code 50 times because we had no idea that that component already existed somewhere else in our code base, right? And by putting everything into its own file and giving it a very specific name and very specifically thinking about what it does and what it should be called, you actually prevent that from happening because you're much more likely to remember which files you have compared to which code you have, if that makes any sense. So highly recommend putting it into separate files. That's sort of what I would recommend. Obviously, do whatever you enjoy. If you prefer style.js files, you're totally cool with do whatever you think. I personally put everything into separate files because I think it works better for the teams that I've been a part of. And then there's another question from Hans. Is the critical CSS path analysis only useful with server-side rendering, or are there advantages if you only run client-side? No, that is also useful when you run client-side because it's the same thing on the client. We only inject the CSS that you actually use, right? If you're doing code splitting, the JavaScript bundle will include mostly only the CSS that is used, plus minus some states and stuff. It's not entirely the best, but it's still great. And then on the client, we still only inject the CSS that is used. But then with the insert rule API that I talked about, injecting CSS is so fast that it doesn't really make that much of a difference. We still do it because it's just the way it works. Like it's just fully automatic. There's nothing, we don't have to do any extra work to make it happen. That's just the way it works. But it's like not that big of a deal on the client side. You know, it's definitely a bigger deal on the server side where you're literally sending down an HTML file with an inline style tag, and that inline style tag only has the exact CSS that you need to render the page. That's definitely a much bigger benefit, and it's much harder to do with any other tool, if that makes any sense. Loic asks, why does it sound impossible to simply reach a maturity in this matter and more generally in informatics and avoid to have a new library version every 3 to 6 months? I actually think that we're at a point of maturity now. That's why we have seen there's so few innovation in this space recently, but that's not actually a good thing because we're not even nearly to the most productive we could be, right? I actually love that about the JavaScript ecosystem and the JavaScript community, that we keep inventing new things that make all of us more productive and better and make us write better apps, right? Whatever you think of React, even if you're not using React, even if you're using just HTML and CSS and then maybe some jQuery, or you're using Vue or Angular, it doesn't really matter. All of these things have gotten 5 million times better over the past 20, whatever years it's been, 1993, I think Tim Berners-Lee wrote his paper, so the last 27 years. Imagine having to write HTML and CSS, just that, not even CSS, HTML at the start and then CSS 2 years or whatever later. Point being, it's gotten a lot easier to build any kind of thing in a browser over the past 27 years. And I want that to keep happening because I want, in 27 years from now, I want to be another 5 million times more productive, right? I want people to be able to build even more complex apps on the web so that you can really build anything with the same toolkit and be much more productive, much faster and much quicker. Yeah, of course, there's some churn there. You have to keep learning things, which is sort of annoying sometimes. But it does make everything much more productive, and I'm actually a huge fan of that. I don't think that's a bad thing. I actually think that's a great thing. It's why our community is so great, honestly. I hope that didn't really answer the question. It was sort of a sidestep, but that's really what I think. I hope that makes sense. You asked, how did you get the idea of style components and how did you get into open source? I have a whole lot of talk about the specific idea, how we came up with the style components API, but I also wrote it down. Just going to link that because that is actually a pretty long story. It's interesting. If you want to read that, I'm going to post a link to just into the chat. If you read that, that sort of explains how we went from, we want to make a CSS-in-JS library and why, into the specific API that it ended up being. It was sort of a bunch of random chance, really. We sort of just sat next to each other for 2 days in Sydney, in the office, hacked on shit, and just came up with this API. It was pure serendipity, pure happenstance that we ended up with that API, to be honest. And then the second question was, how did you get into open source? I've kind of always been into open source. I didn't ever think that I was doing anything special, but I see a lot of people that don't do it. Here are my thoughts on open source. Open source is a high reward, no risk endeavor, right? If you make an open source library, the worst thing that happens is that you can use it. And that means you never have to solve that problem again, right? You literally never have to solve that problem again. But whatever that is, right? You solve your own. What we do as developers all day long is we solve problems, right? We solve our own problems, we solve our users' problems, we solve our organization's problems. We solve problems. If you can extract one of those solutions and make it its own package, why wouldn't you make that open source? What's the downside? There's literally none. Zero. The worst thing that happens is that you don't have to write that code again for the next app. You can just install your package and use it. But then the best case scenario is that you make the next React, that you make the next style components, that you make the next Babel, that you make the next whatever big JavaScript library you like, right? And your career gets boosted and kickstarted to a level that you couldn't have achieved otherwise. So there's no risk. The worst case scenario is that you don't have to write the same code again, and you have a solution for the next time that you have that problem, which is a great worst case scenario. And then in the best case scenario, you become quote unquote professionally famous, right? And you suddenly may have better job opportunities. You get the opportunity to speak at conferences. You get to fly around the world possibly, right? It's super high reward, absolutely no risk. So why wouldn't you do open source, right? That's sort of how I got into it. I made libraries, not because I wanted to become famous. It's just because I didn't want to solve the same fucking problem again. I'm annoyed if I have to solve the same thing again. You know what I mean? So I made React Boilerplate. My first name was open source project. I didn't make it with the intent for other people to use it. I made it with intent so that I wouldn't have to configure Webpack every time. If anybody's used React back in 2015, you know that every single time you made a React app, you had to manually configure Webpack, which nowadays is unimaginable because now we have like Create React App and a bunch of other boilerplates that make that really easy. But at the time, that wasn't a thing. And so every single time I made a React app, I had to manually configure Webpack, which was horrible. And so I only made React Boilerplate because I didn't want to configure Webpack every single time because I was so fucked up and annoyed at Webpack, right? And so the worst case scenario that happens there is that I just don't have to configure Webpack ever again. I can very easily create another React app. In the best case scenario, which is what happened, my boilerplate got posted on Hacker News just randomly by some random person, just by chance, and it reached the front page. And it went from 70 to 3,000 stars in 3 days. And suddenly I was famous, right? And I leveraged that open source success into being able to speak at conferences, which then led to jobs, which then led to even more open source projects like Style Components. That came because I got a job because I made React Boilerplate. Then I got even more jobs. It's just snowballed further and further and further and further, right? And the only way that happened is because I made it open source. And I didn't make it open source with the purpose of becoming famous. I didn't really care at the time. I just wanted a job, really. That's what I wanted. But it just happened, right? If I hadn't done that, it couldn't have happened. Doesn't mean that every time you make something open source, you're going to get famous, of course. That's totally not what happens. I have 100 open source projects that nobody ever fucking uses, not even me, right? I probably have 50 packages on NPM and then 100 repos on GitHub. And many of them, nobody's ever used, or I used it maybe another time and that's it. And that's fine, right? It doesn't matter. The worst case scenario is nobody uses it. And then what? Nothing changed for me, you know? Best case scenario, you get to be professionally well-known for being a great coder.
Thank you for that answer.
That was a really long monologue. I'm sorry. I hope I hope I didn't. Omar says, "Can we have Max speak weekly, please?" I don't have that many interesting things to say. This is sort of these are sort of the most interesting things I can say. So I don't think I could speak weekly, but I'm glad that people are enjoying it. And then there was another question in the middle there. Are you still actively maintaining style components yourself? How do you manage, delegate things? It's actually kind of interesting. I don't actively write code anymore, but I do a lot more project management. I focus a lot on what should we be doing, right? Because we could be doing a lot of things. We could be working on a lot of things. Like, for example, CSS extraction, just like Linaria does, right? We could try to implement that. But it's probably not worth our time because Linaria already has that figured out and they do it really well. So we probably should just recommend using Linaria. And then, so what should we do? For example, recently we launched version 5, which sort of put this entire performance thing to bed because we were like, the library got another, 50% faster over having become 200% faster over the past 2 years anyways. And the reason that happened is because we rewrote the entire core. It was still, the core of style components was still the same code that we wrote 3 years ago, Glenn and I rewrote, and it was not great. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't great by any means. And so we made a very concerned effort to improve that and to completely rewrite the core, which made everything much more performant and much smaller bundle size wise. And so I sort of do a lot of the project management there. I figure out what should we be focusing on, what should we be doing. I talk to the other core maintainers, I talk to the community, what do people need, what do they want? And that's really it. Nowadays, it's so stable that honestly, there isn't that much to do anymore. There's really any bugs anymore. There's some features we could add, but they're sort of really niche, so most of them we don't really add anymore. It's really stable and mature. if that makes any sense. I hope that answers that question. Also, I should say, just on Friday, a documentary about my story, about my open source story, was released. This is totally free. You can watch it on YouTube. I'm not saying this because I wanna because I get anything for this. I don't actually make any money off of this documentary or anything, but it is a team of filmmakers came to Vienna. They interviewed me, my parents, my best friends, and they sort of dissected how I went from being in high school and then dropping out of university twice to making these really big open source projects, similar to what I just talked about with React Boilerplate and being posted on Hacker News. And it's really, it's a nice documentary. If you have, it's 11 minutes long. It's not that long. It's like a mini documentary. If you have 11 minutes, I highly recommend watching it. It's pretty fun to watch, I think. And it sort of goes into much more detail there and into much more depth of my specific story and how I approach open source. Now I feel like a sellout, even though I'm not even selling anything. I'm sorry. I don't have anything to sell. I just really like that it exists. It's a really nice movie, I think, from people's reactions. And yeah if you're into that topic.
I totally recommend the documentary. I watched it. It's pretty nice because it really encourages people into open source, like you said, and I found it really nice.
Thanks. That's very nice for you to say. So I'm not the only one saying it.
No, it's really nice. Yeah. Actually, I have one or two questions, but it's more like about the lifestyle that you have. So since you're traveling a lot for conferences, etc., do you have like a preferred conference or like some conferences that are your favorites that you recommend to people?
That's a great question. There's, what are my favorite conferences? There's okay. Most of these are going to be React focused. So if you're not, yeah, of course you can ask me anything, Hans. Don't worry about CSS-in-JS. I'll answer the question soon. All these conferences are going to be React conferences because that's most of the conferences that I've attended. I've been to a couple generic JavaScript ones, but I find that the more specialized conferences are more interesting because there's more like hardcore people there under air quotes, people who are deeper in that specific topic and that I'm interested in. So at React conferences, you'll find lots of people that do really interesting stuff with React, which is what I'm interested in. General JavaScript conferences are cool, but I prefer React conferences in general. And so out of all of the React conferences, the best ones that I've been to have been AgentConf, which is one in Austria. That's in the very west of Austria. And that's a 2-day conference. And then you go skiing on the biggest mountain in Austria for 2 days with all the other people, which is fucking awesome. It's really rad. Highly recommend going to AgentConf. The other one is ReactConf Australia. That's a bit further away. That's in Sydney. That was for the first time this year, just before coronavirus. And that was a fucking amazing conference. Super smart people there. The venue was amazing. The talks were great. The people were super funny and amazing. I had a great time. And then the third one that is much closer to Belgium, probably the closest, I think, is React Amsterdam, which you've also been to, I think you said. React Amsterdam is also really, really, really good. I highly recommend going to that one as well.
Yeah, thank you.
I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I really like React Amsterdam as well.
It's a great conference. They do a great job.
Yeah.
They also do some others. Same people also do React Day Berlin and React Advanced London. I've been to React Day Berlin. It's similarly great to React Amsterdam. I haven't been to React Advanced London, but I assume it's just as great as React Amsterdam. Highly recommend those as well. And then Hans also asked another question in chat. Could you tell us where you see Reason going in the future? I have absolutely no experience with Reason at all. I'm sorry. So I can't really answer that question. Some good friends of mine from Vienna are very deep in Reason and they are really invested in it. In fact, one of them runs the Reason Association. But I've really never used it in production and I don't really keep up to date with what's happening there. So I don't really know. I'm sorry. And Reason, for everybody that doesn't know, ReasonML is a sort of language that compiles to JavaScript. It's based on OCaml, but it compiles down to JavaScript and it's very functional. It's fully functional, fully typed, strict type system. It's a pretty great language, I think. I've just never been able to use it in any of my projects because for team reasons and whatever. I would like to at some point, but I don't really know what the future is.
Okay, I don't know if guys do have other questions. For me, my last question is more about your future projects. So can you tell us a bit about I know that you work at Gatsby now. Mm-hmm. So what's coming next? What's actually the future? there.
It's funny that you asked that, because at Gatsby, I'm sort of on the team that's our official name internally is the themes team, the Gatsby themes team, but that's not really what we do. What we do is we are working on the low code or no code story for Gatsby. So in, I hope, a year, maximum of 2 years, hopefully more like half a year, we'll see how fast we are, you'll be able to go on gatsby.com, gatsbyjs.com, click create a new website. You'll get a drag and drop editor where you can drag and drop React components around to build a website. Then you click save. That actually creates a Gatsby site based on React and JavaScript. It creates actual code, pushes it to GitHub, creates a repo, deploys it, and you've just made a website, a normal standard Gatsby site, just like you would write manually, but you've done it entirely visually, right? Without having to touch any code. Now, for developers, that's sort of like, yeah, sure, cool, I guess, right? That's nice. But it really enables people to do things that they couldn't do before, right? For us developers, it's like, yeah, we could also just write the code. But for example, for your marketing team, they can now create landing pages without having to beg you for your time, without having to annoy you that you have to create another landing page that needs to be optimized, right? They can just do it themselves. If you have project managers that want to make landing pages for your projects, that want to make analytics or whatever, they can just plug together the pages themselves. And so I'm really excited about this. I don't want to say no code, because if you're thinking about like Squarespace or Wix or Webflow, those are completely no code, right? You don't get to access any code. You just make a website visually and then that gets deployed and that's it. But with our approach, you're going to be able to drop down to the code level. So when eventually somebody makes a website, right? Imagine like a bakery in your hometown makes a website by themselves, right? And then eventually they want to add custom functionality, whatever that is, something that can't be done visually, right? Maybe they want to add a mini game to the website for fun, right? Or they want to add a booking system or whatever they want, right? They can come to you and be like, hey, can you add this to our website? And you're like, yeah, I can, because it's just code, right? You git clone the repo, you write your JavaScript, you deploy it, and that's it, right? It's just code under the hood. It's all code at the end, right? And so it's much more extensible. It's much better to use in general. And I think really could be the future. I'm not saying it will be the future, because there's a lot of work for us to figure out to get there, but we're getting there, right? We're working on that right now, and we'll see how it goes. Mailing in chat said Gatsby is buying Webflow. You heard it here first. I think that's happening. Webflow is interesting, but not quite what we need. But that would be funny. I don't think that's happening. I'm sorry, but that would be hilarious.
Okay, guys, any other question?
If there's no more questions, then I just want to thank you for listening. Thanks for the great questions. I hope this was useful. I hope this was entertaining. I hope you enjoyed your evening at the meetup. I hope I could provide some maybe new thoughts, maybe something to think about. Yeah, I hope you liked it. Thanks for coming, I guess.
For me, I really liked it. I'm sure I see people thanking you a lot in the
I see that. So thank you, folks.
Thanks a lot, Max, for being here. Thanks for being part of BeJS.
It was really nice. Thanks for having me.
Thank
I hope at some point I can actually come to Belgium again. I really like my time in Belgium, so I really want to come back. And maybe then we can do another meetup in person, and then we can grab a beer afterwards and hang out.
Yeah, that
grab some waffles or whatever.
French fries as well.
Yeah, French fries. Yeah, for sure. Oh, yeah, some great French fries. I miss those French fries. Damn.
Yeah.